So our previous speakers have talked about resources, or as I like to say, stuff, in terms of stuff that we are taking from the Asia-Pacific region. We are taking oil, we are taking minerals, we are taking timber, we are taking land. A lot of people, when they see this region, they see a place where we can take stuff. But we also see it, too many people also see it as a place where we can dump the stuff that we don't want. And that's what I want to talk about, which is sort of the corollary to taking the stuff we want and then dumping the stuff we don't want. So for many people in the US, even in Australia, in Japan, and in Europe, this is basically a giant rubbish bin or a giant dumping ground. One of the things that we export, which you may have heard about, is that we export hazardous pesticides. Now, it is disgusting to make and export these pesticides, especially because a lot of the places where they're being exported in this region lack the, not even good enough regulations that we have in terms of worker health and safety. So people are applying them without the same training, without the same protective gear. Often the labels are in English, so the people applying them can't even read the labels. So that's bad enough, but to make it even worse, our government allows companies here to manufacture pesticides that we know are very, very dangerous. I mean, that's kind of redundant, a dangerous pesticide. I mean, it's a pesticide. But our government allows companies to manufacture pesticides here that we deem are too dangerous to use here, that are banned, restricted, or never registered, and we are allowed to export them to other countries. That is a glaring double standard. If these pesticides are too dangerous for children in Berkeley, they are too dangerous for children in the Solomon Islands, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, anywhere they are too dangerous for use. So that is a glaring example of a double standard. We've heard a lot about, or we tend to hear more about this kind of export of hazard than others because a lot of the food comes back to us. So we're actually exposing ourselves. So we're actually consuming food with the banned pesticides, the pesticides that we have determined are too dangerous for us. That term is called the circle of poison. It was really popularized by this 1981 book by the Center for Investigative Reporting on circle of poison. So a lot of these pesticides are coming back. So we tend to hear more about that because we are at risk. In addition to the risks from the ongoing export of pesticides, and it's extreme. The United States exports about 32 tons of pesticides an hour, like enormous amounts of pesticides. In addition to the ongoing exports, there's a problem with stockpiles of pesticides. Lots and lots of pesticides, millions and millions of tons of pesticides were exported from the US and Europe to so-called developing countries or less industrialized countries over the last many decades, a lot over the 60s and 70s. Often the exporting company got development aid, and they were often the wrong pesticide or they were mislabeled. The export was really meeting the exporting company's needs rather than the importing country's needs. And so there are these stockpiles of pesticides all over the less industrialized world, including in Asia and the Pacific. Some of them have been sitting there for 20, 30 years. The barrels are starting to leak. It is a huge problem. A global movement has developed that is calling for return to vendor. Send these back to the company who sent them. The problem is a lot of the labels have deteriorated, so we don't know. This is a real example where we need massive international collaboration and solidarity to clean up these toxic pesticide stockpiles. Luckily, there is resistance all over. There's wonderful organizations working on the ongoing export of pesticides as well as the stockpiles. I really recommend you look at Pesticide Action Network, PAN. There's an Asia-Pacific region that is just cranking. There's an international network working on the stockpile issues called IPEN, IPEN, lots of organizations from the grassroots to the international policy. So that's one kind of export, is the export of hazardous pesticides. Often, manufacturing the pesticides here is even too toxic for us, so we export the whole entire industry. So we see a migration of the entire manufacturing process overseas. The most famous example, of course, was Bhopal, the worst chemical industrial disaster in history. Bhopal was in India. It was a US company that was manufacturing toxic pesticides there in India under conditions that would never be allowed here. There was a gas leak. Some people call it an accident. It was actually an inevitability. There was not an accident. I mean, the factory was run so sloppily that it was just waiting for this to happen. there's different numbers of estimates on how many people died. It's hard to know because the Indian government just dumped lots of them into mass graves, so it wasn't possible to count. The death toll is now at over 20,000, and it is continuing. These are some of the Bhopal survivors. They don't call themselves victims. They're not Bhopal victims. They're Bhopal survivors, and they are fighting back and linking up with other survivors that have been exposed to toxic chemicals or who live near these plants all around the world. And their slogan, which is such a representation of global solidarity, is "No more Bhopals." There's also great resistance happening in terms of NGOs and people's movements and governments getting more strict about screening foreign investments. This is an excellent resource, this book called Screening Foreign Investments. The countries can say, yes, we will take your technologies, but we want your cleanest, best technologies. We want to leapfrog over that whole toxic-laden, dirty industrial development model and share the cleanest, greenest, best technologies instead of being a dumping ground for technologies that we don't want anymore. So that we export hazardous pesticides, we export hazardous industries. We also export enormous amounts of hazardous waste. This was an incredible example in the Marshall Islands. There was a company up in Seattle who was concerned about how much garbage there was in Seattle, and they were trying to decide what to do with all this garbage. So they had this idea to take it to the Marshall Islands and put it on the Marshall Islands to make the Marshall Islands higher so that they would be more resilient to sea level rises. And they actually said this was a win-win-win situation. Seattle gets rid of its garbage, Marshall Islands gets higher, you don't have to worry about rising sea levels. I mean, obviously that is absolutely insane. The thinking behind this is really embodied in this very famous memo from Lawrence Summers, who was, in 1991, he was the chief economist at the World Bank. Yes, this is right. Remember this whenever his name comes up for a new political appointment. In 1991, he wrote this memo that he said was for internal discussion only at the World Bank, but somebody leaked it out. In it, he argued for exporting more hazardous stuff to what he called less developed countries. He said, and this is a quote, "I think the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and we should face up to that." And he said that because of a number of reasons. One is that a person's value is based upon their earning potential, and these people earn less than we do. Second, a lot of the exposure to these toxic chemicals causes health impacts later in life, and these people aren't going to live long enough to get those diseases anyway. He actually said this, and he also said that vast areas of less developed countries are underpolluted, and so he thought that we could actually add more. This mentality, even though Lawrence Summers is no longer at the World Bank, and he said he meant it to be ironic, but in any case, that mentality really underlies our international trade in hazards. Now, Pacific Islands are somewhat protected now from imported waste because they have a Wangani Convention that was signed in 1995 that limits waste imports into the region, but it's very hard to stop waste imports into the region if exporting countries are still exporting it. So we really have to work here to stop waste exports. Over the last couple of decades, the kind of really outrageous schemes like that dumping on the Marshall Islands have slowed down. There are less than there used to be, but there are still major streams of very hazardous waste that are being exported. One of the biggest ones is e-waste, which is all of our cell phones, televisions, laptops, all of these electronics that we churn through. E-waste is the fastest growing and most hazardous part of our municipal waste stream. The reason it is hazardous is because all of those gadgets have a lot of toxic material: lead, cadmium, mercury, hexavalent chromium, brominated flame retardants, PVC. They also have valuable stuff. Every cell phone has about 50 cents worth of gold in it, has copper, it has some valuable materials, but lots and lots of hazardous stuff. And so our companies want the valuable parts, but they don't want the hazardous stuff. So what they do is they export it overseas. This shows a map of where e-waste is exported. It's certainly not only Asia and the Pacific, but you see a big concentration around Asia and the Pacific. Just to show you an example, I've snuck into these facilities all over the region, and these are some different photographs from places in the region. These flat screen monitors that nobody wants anymore because they're ugly, have like 4 to 7 pounds of lead each in them. You know, lead is a potent neurotoxin, and we are sending those all overseas. Of the e-waste that is given for recycling in this country, about 80% of it is exported. Next. So you see people with no protection break them open, pull out the hazardous stuff. Here you see a big pile of women with the wires that are coated with PVC, and they're taking off all the PVC to get the copper inside. They often just light them on fire to burn the PVC off so they can get the copper. If you burn PVC, you create dioxin, and the presence of copper increases the amount of dioxin you take. And so this is enormously hazardous for the people who live around these facilities. Now, if you do recycle your e-waste, which is the right thing to do when you're done with it, make sure you give it to a recycler that is e-Stewards certified. E-Stewards certified recyclers promise not to send their e-waste to other countries. That is a good thing to do in the immediate, but it's not a long-term solution. The long-term solution is to force these companies to make these gadgets safe and durable so we don't have to keep replacing them all the time. We want them made it safe and made to last. So that the real leverage is how these things are designed. We want them repairable, recyclable, and we want them to last for a long time. I remember when I was little, we had one toaster my whole life. Like nowadays, it's every 9 months. You know, cell phones, the average life of a cell phone in this country is 11 months. The only consumer product with a shorter lifespan is an ice cream cone. I mean, it is absolutely insane. It is insane. So we need to force these companies to make them safe and make them last. We need to resist the upgrade and stop churning through them like a fashion accessory. And we need to stop looking at other parts of the world as disposable. Our resources are not disposable, and other parts of the world are not disposable.
Yay.
Next. One of the reasons that international waste trade is slowing down is because of this Basel Convention. The Basel Convention is a UN convention which restricts the export of hazardous waste from OECD to non-OECD countries. This banner we hung when the Basel Convention was signed, it said it now criminalizes toxic terror. Oh, sorry, I forgot which banner picture I used. This was our second banner. The first one we said was that it now legalizes toxic terror because the original Basel Convention just set up a regulatory mechanism to allow waste exports to continue. It has since been amended to have a ban so that now OECD countries are prohibited from exporting hazardous waste to non-OECD countries. There are some loopholes around the recycling issue that we're still working on, and there's one industrialized country in the world that has not ratified this convention, which is the United States. If you're interested in that, there's an excellent organization working on it. It's called the Basel Action Network because the international convention is called the Basel Convention. It's ban, BAN.org, which you can remember because we want to ban waste exports. Oh, these are some of the activists around the world that are fighting international waste trade. Very vibrant movement against it. So the latest rage in exporting hazardous things to Asia and the Pacific is exporting incinerators. Now, incinerators are so stupid. They are these giant machines that burn resources. Now, we have just been hearing about all these resource constraints in the world. What on earth are we doing spending hundreds of millions of dollars building giant machines designed to destroy resources? Like, it simply doesn't make sense from a sustainability and resource stewardship perspective. As well, the emissions from these things are absolutely horrible. Actually, on the left over there is a diagram of a proposed incinerator in Hong Kong. This is what an incinerator actually looks like. That's just a computer-generated picture. They don't actually look like that in real life. So incinerators produce enormous pollutions coming out the smokestack, enormous toxic waste that you then have to deal with. But even worse, incinerators lock your regions into continued waste production. These things are like waste addicts. They work most efficiently if they run around the clock rather than in batches. So if your region builds one of these things, your government is going to be committed to continue to produce that waste because it needs that materials, it needs that stuff to burn to keep operating. So we're really upset to watch this migration of incinerator proposals into Asia, the Pacific. Enormous resistance. This is an action from the Philippines. The Philippines is the only country in the world with a ban on incineration. There are some loopholes in that ban, and it is being really contested by international development agencies and corporations, so it needs a lot of support. These are just a couple of other examples. There is very strong resistance to incinerators all over Asia and the Pacific because people realize the environmental health and justice impacts. This excellent organization, Gaia, is the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives. If you're interested in more information on incinerators, that is the URL. I just happened to see the international coordinator of Gaia is standing in the back. If you could just stand up. Gaia is based in the Philippines, but the international coordinator happens to be here today. They are coordinating movements all around the world that are fighting these things and working for safe solutions. So we export hazardous pesticides, we export hazardous industries, we export hazardous waste, we export hazardous incinerators. But do you know what is the most hazardous export of all? Capitalism is close. That's what it is. But our most hazardous export is this toxic-laden, growth-obsessed, capitalist, racist, cost-externalizing, consumer-driven way of organizing a society. Now, when I talk about consumerism, I'm not speaking against consumption. Consumerism is different than consumption. We all need to consume to live, and a lot of people in Asia and the Pacific actually need to consume more to have a healthy life. What I'm talking about is consumerism. Consumerism is that relationship to consumption where we find our meaning, we demonstrate our social value, we demonstrate our worth, we turn to stuff rather than people for fulfillment and joy and meaning. That's consumerism, and that's the problem. See this cartoon? Look, honey, I bought something today. Oh, darling, I'm so proud of you. It's that kind of culture that is the danger, that makes consumption not a means to live, but a means of showing who we are. As a result of this spread, we are seeing a massive spread of Walmarts and massive mega consumption all over Asia and the Pacific. Walter talked about being corralled into schools to be taught about to be indoctrinated into sort of Western imperial culture. We don't need to corral people anymore because we lure them in with things like this. Next up, the shopping mall is the new place where we bring people in to indoctrinate them into this culture. The largest shopping malls in the world now are in China, Malaysia, and the Philippines. That is the new sort of imperialist culture spreader. As a result of this, our consumer muscles have grown so big that it has become our primary identity, where our citizen muscles have atrophied. And that is a real danger, because in order to respond to these kinds of dangers, we need to work together as engaged citizens. But we are not related to and spoken to and validated as citizens. Our consumer self has developed so much. That's why you often hear the word consumer and human being interchangeably. So we really need to step out of our consumer self into our citizen self. Resistance, I could not put a picture of resistance here because it is everywhere. All over the world, people are rising up against this. I think that the resistance to this hazardous migration or exporting harm is best summed up by a sentence a Filipino friend told with me. He said, "We need to change NIMBY, not in my backyard, to NOPE, not on planet Earth." We need to find a different way to live. Woo. Thank you so much.
That was brilliant. Thank you.